Thank you for coming along tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Tanarunk and Bunurong people whose lands border our region, and may the work that we all do in the environmental sector and in the environment foster meaningful collaboration with traditional owners who have cared for our land for tens of thousands of years. So we're here tonight to hear about biochar, and you'll be hearing from us. So my name's Patricia, I'm the Sustainability Officer at Yarra Ranges Council, and as a part of my role I contract manage the facility, and I'll be talking about why we have a facility in our region and how it works. My colleague Jörg Verden is the coordinator of sustainability at Yarra Ranges Council, and he's also a biochar subject matter expert, having done his PhD on the topic a few years ago. And he'll be talking to you about what biochar is and what the benefits are, so more of a technical overview. And Kylie looks after ECO's Earth education, and she'll be talking about the exciting trials that are being done at ECO's with biochar and also other great local examples. And so to understand why we have a biochar facility, it's important to take a look at the context of our region. So we're the largest local government area in Greater Melbourne at 2,500 square kilometres, and we have the lowest population density at 166 people per square kilometre. In terms of land use breakdown, 5% is residential land, 30% is agricultural land, and 65% is parkland and forest. So we're a very heavily forested region, as you all know. And as a community, we're very lucky, and we get to spend time in lots of areas that look like this. But as you all know, on the flip side, there's also this. When big storm events pass through, there can be a lot of damage and a lot of woody waste debris that needs to be processed as a result. So this led us to open a biochar facility in 2023, and to be able to process this woody waste debris as feedstock. And the facility was also in action in our Livable Climate Action Plan, which covers a 10-year period from 2020 to 2030. And the reason it's in action in this plan is due to several factors. So one being the environmental benefits of biochar, which we'll go into more detail later. Another being the circular economy benefits, so converting a waste product like woody waste debris into a high value product like biochar. And the third being to enhance disaster resilience in our region. And the facility is located in Lysterfield, and it's quite a strategic location. It's close to other council areas. It's located on a main highway and next to a resource recovery centre. And we're the first council-owned biochar facility in Victoria, and it's also the first facility to be licensed by the Environmental Protection Agency. While we're the first, we're certainly not the last, and there are many other organisations in Victoria which are currently exploring establishing their own biochar facilities. So the water treatment plants South East Water and Barwon Water are currently investigating converting sewage sludge into biochar. And what we expect this will mean is that as more biochar products come onto the market, the pricing will become more competitive. And as a council, we also often get many inquiries and requests for site visits from other councils which are interested in managing components of their own waste through the establishment of a biochar facility. In terms of the historical use of biochar, so biochar has its roots in traditional charcoal production and has been used for thousands of years. The indigenous communities in the Amazon practiced terra preta agriculture as far back as 7,000 years ago, and they enriched the soil in the Amazon by mixing it with biochar. And large deposits of this black earth can be found today, as can be seen in the bottom left image. And it's still supporting plant growth. And this demonstrates what makes biochar so valuable, is its permanence. So essentially, once it's put in the soil, the carbon that it contains is effectively locked away for centuries, making this process highly irreversible, which has made it eligible for carbon dioxide removal certificates, which are otherwise known as CORCs. So it's considered a carbon sequestration technology. So how is biochar made? Well, to make biochar, a complex and highly controlled process unfolds, and this is an image of our biochar facility. And so local arborists that are working in surrounding areas collect woody waste debris and they drop it off in the feedstock bay on the left. And they do so free of charge, which incentivises them to bring it to the facility. If they were to take it to a resource recovery centre, they'd have to pay a fee to drop it off. And it's important to note here that our facility only processes woody waste debris from fallen trees and branches and woody weeds, and no other material is processed at the facility, and we only at this stage accept collection from private arborists. And then the loading hopper collects the feedstock and ships it into the dryer. And then once it's dry enough, it's moved into the pyrolysis chamber, where it's heated between 500 and 600 degrees Celsius. And with very little oxygen, which prevents combustion. During this process, two products are created. So the volatile compounds are released and are captured by the wood vinegar plant. And this is used as natural fertiliser and pest repellent. And the biochar quenching auger then is responsible for rapidly cooling the biochar as it leaves the pyrolysis chamber, preventing it from combusting and oxidising. And the bag loader then bags the biochar ready for distribution.
How much did that cost, Bill?
$1.4 million, but we'll have time for questions at the end, if that's okay. And while our technology is quite complex, this is a much simpler machine that can be used as an alternative, the Kentucky kiln, just to show an example of it. And this is the output that we're aiming for with our biochar facility. We're aiming to produce 1,000 cubic metres of biochar a year, which would sequester approximately 575 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. We're in the process of becoming internationally accredited for carbon credits, and locally produced biochar is available for sale through Green Man Char and ECOS. And I'll now pass over to Jörg.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about biochar and why it works and what sort of the mechanisms are. And they're still evolving. There's a huge amount of research being done on biochar, and it has really exponentially skyrocketed over the last decades, the interest in biochar. So I'm by no means an expert across all of the things, but I think I have a good idea about the basics about it. So we can define biochar as something very complex, or we can just say it's a type of charcoal, which essentially it is. So it's just heating biomass, carbon-based organic biomass without oxygen. And so by that, you're condensing the carbon and you're locking it up into an aromatic molecular structure. All biochars are not created equal. So making it from organic material, so there's a vast range of organic materials. There's and as vast as the different sources of organic material are, as much are there different types of biochar. So it's kind of hard to describe one single biochar because it's not. Like, it depends on how it's made, what it's made from, how it's processed after the pyrolysis. And because that makes it so variable, that's kind of a nuisance when you're researching it, because you need a single source to have sort of a good idea where it came from, how it was made. But it also lends itself to, well, turn it around, and the concept of designer biochars, that you kind of produce it in a certain way to address specific soil deficiencies. So biochar has been produced to specifically target some heavy metals in some applications, where it absorbs heavy metals, or you can produce it for greater porosity. So there's a lot of sort of measures that you can adjust how it's produced and from what it's produced. In general, it's very lightweight. So the biochar that we are producing on a dry weight basis, on a dry basis, is about 250 kilograms per cubic meter, and has because it's so porous, has a high water holding capacity. It's stable. Patricia mentioned it. Once it's amended in a soil, it remains there. Particularly wood biochars with a high aromatic carbon content remains there for centuries to millennia. Due to its surface properties, it has a high nutrient retention capacity, or let's say a nutrient exchange capacity. And because we are producing it at Lysterfield only from hardwood, or hard and softwood, mainly hardwood, wood chip, and due to its process conditions, so we are pyrolyzing it at around 550 degrees. And there's a thermal oxidizer attached to the plant. That means we are getting rid of most of volatile components that have any toxicity. There. So, I mentioned it before, can be made from a lot of different types: agricultural waste, woody waste, particularly relevant to our facility, manure, sewage sludge, even car tires, because they are carbon-based. And sort of just a couple of images to show you. So what you put in, you kind of get out in terms of structure. So there's a high similarity between the input material and the output material. And that sort of highlights how variable the biochars are. And so particularly relevant at Yarra Ranges Council, as Patricia mentioned, woody debris after storm disasters, like we end up with thousands and thousands of tons of waste wood at different points in time. And I think that's probably where the idea was born, sort of to, what do we do with this? Like, we have this huge amount of waste. Gets chipped, gets left in the forest, but there's a certain threshold up to how much you can do that. Also, mulch turns into atmospheric carbon within 3 to 5 years. So whatever the plants absorb during their lifetime is essentially reintroduced to the atmosphere within a matter of a couple of years, whereas biochar sort of stabilizes it for a long period of time. Probably just going back on this little graphic there about what a hardwood structure essentially looks like. So we have the vessels responsible for transporting solutes within the tree and water up the tree trunk. And we have the fibers that are mainly there for stability of the tree to stand up. And so essentially, if you imagine it, it's a bundle of pipes. Right? That's what wood essentially is in a longitudinal direction. And so these are two microscopic images. On the left-hand side, Eucalyptus regnans, so mountain ash. Like a very lightweight, comparably, wood, about 600 kilograms per cubic meter. And what makes it so lightweight is essentially the cell walls around the fibers. That is the main volume that creates wood density, essentially. So wood density is a measure of how much cell wall material per volume of wood you have. And in my research, I had a bit of a closer look because I thought, well, if the wood, when it's converted into biochar, is reflected in the biochar structure, then the different fiber and vessel structure should result in different porosities. So a lightweight wood should therefore create biochar that has a higher porosity and therefore a higher water holding capacity. Turns out that's right. So I was very happy with that, I must say. And this is an image or a microscopic image of a biochar. And I think the similarities are striking. So fibers turn into this. and vessels are that. So bear with me here. So just walking you through a bit about the water retention properties of biochar. So on the top there, you have sort of different stages of a soil. So when it's fully saturated after a big rain event and you're walking over a meadow and you hear the squelching, that's sort of the full saturation method or stage. So that means the soil will drain over time according to gravity. And then the next one to the right is field capacity. So that's essentially the amount of water that a soil can hold against gravity. And that's sort of the start for plants to take it up once the sun is shining again and once they need water to metabolize. Third one is the stress point. So once the main pores or the large macropores in the soil dry out, water adheres to soil particles. And the smaller the pore size where the water is trapped, the stronger those pores hold on to the water. So there's a direct correlation with the pore size and the negative pressure by which that water is held. And so the lower the water content in a soil, the harder it becomes for plants to extract that. And then there's wilting point, or permanent wilting point, it's often called. And that's around about 1500 kilopascal, or 15 bar, or 150 meter water column. So it's quite a bit of pressure. And that's where most plant species sort of cease to be able to extract water from a soil. And on that range, this is sort of this is the plant available water. So the difference between the field capacity and the water remaining at permanent wilting point. So that water in that range is available to plants to trap carbon from the atmosphere and grow. And this is research from Lysterfield Carvalho, pretty recent, 2020, and they compared an unamended sandy soil or sandy tropical soil. So that's the top one there. The green line, the 0% biochar added. Megagrams per hectare is equal to tons per hectare. I put the volume calculations there. So 6.25 tons per hectare equals about 0.83% by volume. So less than 1% volume added, up to 3.2% by volume added. And what you can, so correlating it to this plant available water, so that's that range. So everything on the left, that water drains under gravity after a couple of days, that's gone. And everything to the right of the graph is too tightly bound for plants to extract it. So what's important to know about biochar, and this is why I'm showing you this, is that biochar actually adds water across the whole range of the plant available water. So whatever you add at the beginning, you maintain sort of all throughout the water retention curve. And that's actually quite important because the reservoir of water that you want to have in a soil or to make your crop more drought resistant, you want to keep that tightly bound threshold within the soil, because that doesn't get extracted immediately, but it stays in the soil sort of when you have sort of a continuous drought. And biochar is by no means a silver bullet, but it can add sort of like a small threshold for plants to kick over and to survive during a drought period. There was a glasshouse experiment that I helped out with at Burnley. And for green roof plants, we found that they survive droughts on average 2 to 3 days longer than other plants that were not amended with biochar. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but those couple of days can make quite a difference if your crop survives or not. Another point is that even though the plant or the water beyond the threshold of 15 bar or 1500 kPa is not available to plants, but there's sort of growing research that it's available to microbes. So, and that's like an important point when your soil dries out and you have sort of a small threshold of water, you keep the ecology of the soil more stable even through a drought. And so those water retaining properties are directly linked to the porosity of the biochar. Remember the image, or the mind image as this bundle of pipes. Other than water retention, biochar can really help in terms of nutrient retention. And that can be quite important in terms of fertilizer efficiency. So there's growing research that you can sort of reduce fertilizer rates because they are not washed out, essentially, but they are retained within the soil for a longer period of time. So I'd love this image, sort of like a little tiny fledgling pine seedling. The yellow bits, or the more yellow parts, that's the roots, and the more whiter or translucent looking web that is all surrounding it is mycorrhiza. And so there's a direct symbiotic relationship between roots and mycorrhiza. The symbiosis is in terms that the mycorrhiza receives carbohydrates from the plant and provides the plant with water and minerals from the soil. So important or an important relationship to have. And this is from a publication that is excellent, Joseph 2021. I'm more than happy to send that around after the session if you're interested. And it's a publication that is why biochar works and when it doesn't. And they had a look about how biochar develops over time in the soil. So the graphic shows sort of the plant and the connection to the mycorrhiza, and the mycorrhiza sort of connects to those biochar particles in the soil. And because the surface area of the biochar, the microporosity of it, is electrically charged, so it attracts ions, so cations and anions, different points, and it almost reacts as a switch. So it retains. So let's say you have a slow release fertilizer in the soil that breaks down. Whatever the plants don't take up in that moment gets sorbed to the biochar and can be accessed later. And this is an image, the top one. That's after 20 years, so like a biochar particle after 20 years in soil. And the smaller image there, that's mycorrhiza or hyphens that are connecting into the biochar. So there's a direct connection that plants actually, well, they're not looking for it, but I'll just leave it at that. So there's a direct connection there, right? And as a bit of an analogy, it's like this artist, Jason DeCarius Taylor, he puts sculptures under the sea, and over time they colonize with corals. And I think it's a very nice sort of analogy for what biochar does in a soil. It's almost like a house for microbes. And over time, the properties develop, they change. So the raw biochar is very different to a biochar that has been in the soil for a long period of time. This graph, also from the same publication from Joseph et al. So on the x-axis, you have the time in years. The green line is organic material, litter, manure, compost. The black line is the biochar. And so the bottom ochre line, the initial soil carbon level, and what happens over time if you're adding an organic material like litter, manure, or compost, and what happens to biochar. So with non-pyrolyzed organic materials, they pretty much, out of 100%, they decompose, or 90% of that material decomposes within a year, and you add sort of per year about 10% of that organic material to the soil. Biochar doesn't decompose, sort of there is like a liable fraction of it, about 10% over a 3-year period decomposes. However, biochar and roots, with sort of that interaction with mycorrhiza, often build up carbon. So root exudates actually add to the carbon stock in those biochar particles. That means you're pretty much maintaining, and then you're re-adding and re-adding. After 3-4 years, another dose of biochar. And after, don't want to count it now, but after a period of years, you end up with a much higher carbon stock in your soil with biochar addition versus other compost, manure, etc. So where can we use it? Well, you can use it in agriculture and forestry, community gardens, green roofs, because it's a very lightweight material. Facade greening, where you have very constrained soil volumes for large plantings. And rain gardens. And rain gardens, essentially, they're kind of the landfills along the roadside, because they trap everything that gets washed off the road is being concentrated in that little point of area. And it's been quite effective in sorbing pollutants that come with stormwater and increasing the efficiency of rain gardens. And in tree pits, so Stockholm is in their tree program or urban forestry program. They use a lot of biochar as a structural soil because it doesn't decompose. It has similar properties to a structural soil, and they are having great success with that application method. And sort of coming closer to the end, how much biochar do we need? And there's good research from Gale and Thomas, 2019, and they tested sort of dose response to one Trifolium repens, which is a legume, and the other plant I honestly don't know, I can't remember what it was. But they found sort of there's a sweet spot between 20 and 30 tons per hectare. And that equates about 2.5 or 2.6 to 4% by volume. And just to illustrate that, that would be about that much on a liter of soil. So it's a reasonably small dose. So it's not a huge lot of material that you need. So just in summary, so biochar particularly good at improving soil by increasing water retention, increasing nutrient retention, fostering microbial activity, and improving soil structure. 3% by volume is a good middle ground. In terms of biochar particle size, like a fine particle size is beneficial for adding water holding capacity, for instance, in a sandy soil, in a coarse sandy soil, like fast draining, whereas large biochar particles are probably better in clay, dense, slow draining soils. Charging of biochar or adding nutrients before it's amended to a soil is quite important. Otherwise, you have a negative priming effect that you are reducing the availability of nitrogen within the soil. So you can have actually a negative impact at the beginning of a planting. So charging quite important. That can be done by co-composting it or including it in worm farms. That's what I do at home. Adding slow-release fertilizer for native plantings, of course, important to look about the phosphorus content in the fertilizer. Okay, well, thanks very much. And let's talk about it a bit more. And I'm very happy to hand over to Kylie.
I'm here to give the perspective from Yarra Valley Ecos. And for those who might not have heard of Ecos, it's a beautiful inspired permaculture designed property on Wurundjeri land in Wesburn. And Ecos is committed to showcasing sustainable solutions, and it's home to a variety of community initiatives our goals align with a sustainable future. So on site there's a food forest, a community garden, we have Crops for Community, which supports All Abilities volunteers in growing food and donating the produce grown on site to food relief programs. As well as there's artist studios and a number of environment groups. So Ecos is quite a broad community environment hub. And Ecos has partnered with Earth Systems and Yarra Ranges Council to run education programs on biochar for the community, and We're also working alongside local farmers to provide examples of biochar use in the Yarra Ranges. We've worked with a vineyard in Yarra Junction where they actually made their own biochar and applied that to their vines in the hope of reducing water use and improving their soils. We're also working with a small biodynamic market garden, Silvertine Farm, which is also on site at ECOS. And they've trialled adding biochar to some of their beds and have successfully grown various vegetables over the last couple of years in those beds, including lettuce, beans, corn, celery. And so there's a photo. The vineyard is the one with the tractor, and the one down the bottom is Silvertine Farm. We're also planning on working with some bush regenerators who are interested in trialling biochar in their projects to help increase the survival rates of their plants once they're in the ground, particularly for drought resistance in northern Victoria. We're also working with Stu Ryder at Wild Ridge Regenerative Farm in Hillsville, and he's trialling adding biochar in different ratios to some of her paddocks for stock rotation, and he's monitoring the soil and the growth over time. So most of the trials are still in their early stages, and it'll be really interesting to see the results over time. So again, this is a photo on the right of the biochar being applied at Silvertine Farm, and then these are some of the crops that they're growing. So the biochar was added to half the beds, so for comparison for the other half without biochar. So yeah, ECOS is working on these trials to demonstrate carbon sequestration through long-term storage of carbon in the soil in the form of biochar, and hopefully we'll realise soil improvements in the process. So we hope to see an increase in the beneficial soil microbes and symbiotic fungi, and further, as Jörg was saying, the high surface area of the biochar is covered in charges which allow the nutrients in the soil to bond with the biochar. So we're hoping to see less leaching and a reduced need for fertilisers over time. So ECOS has also developed some biochar demonstration plots, which are seen in these photos. So we've now planted 5 by 20 metre beds that have been divided into equal plots and had biochar applied at different soil volume ratios, including control plots without biochar, 1%, 5% and 10% biochar ratios. These plots were replicated 3 times across the beds and prepared with compost, chook pellets and worm casting activated biochar. The beds were planted initially. We trialled Edison potatoes, and then we did a green manure crop followed by garlic, and then we expanded the crops last year to include some 2.5% ratio plots. They were some research that Jörg was referring to suggested that was an optimum level in the soil. So we're now also growing Edison, Dutch cream potatoes and pumpkins in those plots. And it'll be interesting to see how the soil tests over time, what results we see from those. So the trials are being done at relatively small scale, and there are many variables, including the site conditions and the slope and aspect, which could possibly also impact the results. But here are our initial results. So for our first crop of the Edison potato yields, you can see the control is in the purple. So there was no biochar added to that. And So you can see that the control did have the lowest yields, with the 5% being the highest yields, and and all the other plots also had higher yields slightly. So there was definitely an increase in the crop yields from adding the biochar. Similarly with the garlic, the yields were lowest for the control plots, while the highest were for the 5% biochar plots. The 1% yields were actually 16% higher than the control, and the 5% biochar yields were 21% higher than the controls. And interestingly, the 10% was only 4% higher than the control. So from these, you can see the optimum biochar additions would be between 1 and 5% biochar. The pumpkin harvest. So this was a trickier one to measure because pumpkins like to cross out of their boundaries and their plots. And we also had a few different varieties that we were growing, which varied in size as well. However, when we look at the bar at the end, at the total plot yields, so they had the same number of plants per square metre per area, and even though there were 3 different varieties, the yields for the biochar plots overall were actually 40% higher than the ones without biochar. So that was quite significant. And our Dutch cream potato yields, so these were in the more recent additions. So the 2.5% biochar soil volume ratio, so we saw an 8% increase in overall yields compared to the controls. And further, the potatoes that were grown with the biochar had 6% less damage through insect attack or rot, so that was interesting as well. ECOS is also doing some trials in the native nursery, so we grow native plants usually from seed, some from cuttings, and again we're doing trials with the controls 1%, 5% and 10% by soil volume ratio, so in the tubes, which it's a pretty small amount when you're adding to a tube. And we're seeing success with all the plants that we've grown. So we've trialled grasses, shrubs and trees, and they're all very healthy. They are part of the nursery stock, so we don't get to follow them long term. They do sell, but we do hope to have some in the ground that we monitor over time as they're planted in the ground. So, but they're all doing well. Initially, we tend to see a slight increase in the growth rate with the biochar added, but that tends to even out over time. Composting with biochar. So we have a number of various compost systems on site that we've been trialling adding biochar to. Generally, we just add a small amount to the compost when we're adding the food scraps. And so the biochar becomes charged with the nutrients that bind to its large surface area, and that enables the nutrients in the compost to remain in the substrate for longer periods. We've also observed some reduced odours, which could indicate lower levels of methane and ammonia emissions as well. So those trials continue. And so there's a number of ways to apply biochar. You can add it straight to your compost or worm farm, which is a really simple way to use it. You can also apply it with your compost or nutrient mix. It's important to remember that biochar is not a fertiliser, it's a soil improver. So whenever you're adding it, you do need to add some form of compost or seaweed solution, worm casting, something that will provide that fertiliser. And ideally you'd soak it so that it can absorb all those nutrients before using it and before applying it. It's a good idea to target the root zones of the plants, so you can mix it into the soil, into the planting holes, and you can, if you've got existing plants, you can top dress as well. I'll talk about supercharging. So it's recommended to soak it for at least 3 days, up to 2 weeks, and it's a simple, whatever you've got, a bucket or a wheelbarrow, a bathtub. You soak the amount of biochar that you'd like to use with the same amount of nutrient mix, if it's compost or worm castings, and then you completely cover it with water to make sure it's completely submerged, and stirring it really helps to the nutrients and everything to get into the pores of the biochar. And then soak it, and you can add it as a wet slurry directly into your holes, or mix it into plant pots or on the surface. And yes, if you'd like further information, we do run workshops sometimes, or if you'd like a tour of the facility, or to find out more about how to use biochar or how to purchase some, you can contact us. And if you're in the Yarra Ranges Shire, you get a 15% discount if you purchase through ECOS. So thank you.